Welcome to the first faculty seminar of the autumn quarter. My name is Alfredo Artiles. I'm a professor of education at Stanford and the director of the Research Institute at CCSRE. Thank you all for joining us today. We're excited to start our programming for this academic year with this great event. Now, before we begin the event, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma-Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. And consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. The faculty seminar series features new scholarship by Stanford faculty and colleagues from around the world. And we'll say more about that in a moment. But before we introduce our speaker and the interlocutor, I would like to remind you that CCSRE has planned a stimulating, exciting program of events this autumn. Specifically, next week, October 25th, we have another seminar series by Professor Gabriela Safran. She's a professor of Jewish studies and Slavic languages and literature. So I hope to welcome you again next week. On November 8th, Professor Farzana Salim from the GSC will share her work on mental health, again at noon in this room. On November 15th at 4 p.m. in this room, we'll host a Chautauqua with Professor of History Destin Jenkins. So we have three very exciting events coming up. I hope to see all of you back here for those occasions. Please visit our website for additional information, including other opportunities like funding for supporting students' work. Now, I also want you to be aware that the Research Institute will be collecting information on a regular basis this academic year about the scholarship that our faculty, affiliates, and students are producing. And we'll disseminate these achievements via the newsletter and other media. So please keep us in the loop about the excellent work that you're all producing. Now, let me now turn it to Professor Teresa Laframboise to introduce today's speaker and interlocutor. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. As you know, Teresa Laframboise, and I'm the Director of Native American Studies within the Center for the Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity. It's really an honor to be able to introduce our speaker and interlocutor.
Be a little louder.
Oh, it's an honor? Oh, thank you, Hazel. Okay.
Thank you.
That's so good. Good. Okay. Thank you for being here, and it is an honor to be able to introduce our speaker and interlocutor. I'll begin with our invited faculty speaker, Professor Joe Grahn. He's an international expert in the psychology and mental health of American Indians and other indigenous people. He's a professor at Harvard University and has collaborated with many tribal communities for the last 30 years to re-envision conventional mental health services for advancing indigenous well-being. Can you hear me now? Is it any better? Okay. He's a clinical community psychologist and action research, and in those capacities, he has published over 100 scientific articles. He's a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and a fellow of 7 divisions of the American Psychological Association. Joe is a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Illinois. He was also trained at Dartmouth College and at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. Professor Grahn taught at the University of Michigan for 16 years, where he also directed the Native American Studies program there prior to joining the faculty at Harvard. Joe is an enrolled member of the Aaniih-Gros Ventre Tribal Nation of Montana, and he's also served briefly as the Chief Administrative Officer for the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. Now, I would imagine that was probably, it sounds like and also, but was quite a challenging task. Joe has been honored with more than 20 fellowships and career awards, including the Guggenheim Fellowship. He was a recipient in 2021 of the APA Award for Distinguished Professional Contributions to Applied Research. Just this year, he received the American Psychological Foundation Gold Medal Award for Impact in Psychology. And just last month, he was elected to the National Academy of Medicine. He will be followed by Professor Shashank Joshi as the interlocutor. Shashank is a professor of psychiatry and pediatrics and education at Stanford School of Medicine, and by courtesy a professor of the Graduate School of Education. Shashank is the director of the Triple Board of Residency in Pediatrics, General Psychiatry, and Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. He also serves as a director of school mental health at the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital. And important to us, he's a faculty advisor to CSRE. So please welcome both of them.
To speak with you about some things I've been thinking about. And let me just say, first of all, that Teresa and I have known each other probably 30-some years, going back to when I first, as a graduate student, attended the Society of Indian Psychologists annual conventions at Utah State University. And Teresa, you paved the way for so many of us in academia with that early work that was in Psych Bulletin and American Psychologist, really representing Indian perspectives in those very important places. So thank you for your long service and contribution to the work that we do. And it's really a pleasure to join you today. I'm going to be talking to you really what I would bill as a Native Studies talk. I was visiting at Montana State University some years back, where over the course of the year I made it a point to try to accept every invitation I had to speak around the state, and I ended up giving 12 different talks, and I had to really work hard to figure out how do I break up all that I do into a dozen different things that are not the same talk. So I have a range of talks. This I will just explain as a Native Studies talk, as I think you'll appreciate as we get into this. It's called Recounting Coup, Communicating Indigenous Vitality in the Age of Historical Trauma. So first, thanks again for this invitation, and I appreciate the territorial acknowledgement that was offered as well. Very important to do that these days. I have really a principal goal here today with you that I'll break down in these areas. First, I want to explore both modern and traditional forms of Indigenous life narrative, and I want to juxtapose two prominent speech genres pertaining to life narrative from Indian country. The first would be modern historical trauma narratives, stories we tell about our communities and our families that take account of a great deal of oppression and suffering, and a more traditional set of narratives or speech genres, Northern Plains Coup tales. And for those of you who are involved and studied Indian literature, you probably encountered the idea that coup tales are some of the earliest form of oral tradition that had literary qualities, perhaps is the way people would talk about it. What I want to do today is suggest that these are antithetical types of self-representation, to the degree they're narratives that speak to the self, and then ultimately propose that a neo-traditional form of the coup tale may serve Indigenous self-determination better than historical trauma can do. So I hope that's clear. Let's dive in, because I know we want to have a chance for exchange and so on. Start with an overview of Indigenous historical trauma. Historical trauma, as you might know, is primarily a health concept that's been promoted by Native social work researchers and professional psychologists. So Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, a Lakota social work researcher, is credited with this term emerging into the scientific literature during the 1990s. This followed her training in psychoanalytic clinical work, in which she was working in New York City with therapists who themselves worked with the offspring of Holocaust survivors. There was the concern with PTSD with Holocaust survivors themselves. And then it seemed like the children of Holocaust survivors also had problems that were not only accounted for by their own life experiences, but perhaps had been passed to them in some way by their own parents. And so this is what became known as intergenerational trauma or historical trauma. And Maria, in this work, by all accounts, reasoned back to the suffering of her own people in the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, and really recognized that colonization and genocide in this country were things that Indian communities continue to cope with and contend with. Now, the narrative genre that's most closely tied or affiliated with historical trauma would, of course, be the personal trauma story. Clinicians treat PTSD and trauma in people's lives every day through counseling and therapy. A good number of those treatments involve the crafting of a trauma narrative that is reworked and reprocessed emotionally in ways that can alleviate suffering. So this is very common in with respect to personal trauma in the health sciences and professions. But the personal trauma narrative really then becomes kind of a template or a foundation for historical trauma narratives to a certain degree as well, of how you tell the story about a broader history and a broader collectivity. So what is historical trauma? In a colloquial sense, its most colloquial sense, we can think of it as post-colonial suffering or post-colonial distress. But in an academic sense, it's really been elaborated much more beyond that. And I think the first way to enter it is to recognize it's the wedding of two familiar constructs, historical oppression and psychological trauma. And those have both been with us, historical oppression perhaps for longer than psychological trauma. You put those together and you get really this idea of historical trauma, which has been described in lots of ways, but in probably most current form, it's really conceived mostly as a social determinant of health. That is, health inequities in tribal communities today are said to result from this. The purpose of this historical trauma, as proposed by Maria and Ed Duran and then lots of other Native folks since, I would summarize briefly as having a fourfold contribution. The first is to explain Indigenous health inequities. You know, we have these problems in our communities and people want to know why and how to account for them, and so this offers an explanation. It's also to contextualize those health problems in histories of subjugation so that it doesn't seem that it's just a problem of individuals. Because when it's a problem of individuals, you can get caught up in paralyzing self-blame that prevents you from taking any action. And so it destigmatizes the kind of paralyzing self-blame that affords people to enter into recovery. And from Maria early on, it's always also been about legitimating Indigenous therapeutic traditions. So when Maria coined this, she did it in the context of developing an intervention for Lakota people that was about trying to process this historical trauma and work through it together in a therapeutic endeavor that had Lakota cultural practices involved as well. Now, we're familiar with personal trauma, we're familiar with PTSD, which was formally legitimated through the adoption of the DSM-3 in 1980. And so we're kind of familiar with that, but historical trauma differs from personal trauma in some key ways, at least as it's been regularly formulated. And my students and I refer to this as the 4 C's of Indigenous historical trauma. The 4 C's, the first is the colonial injury. That is, we're not talking about earthquakes or other like natural disasters, we're talking about histories of subjugation. It's second, it's collectively experienced. It's not just about this one individual or that family, but about entire communities who've been subject to that subjugation. It's cumulatively escalating, in part because colonial subjugation was not one thing. It certainly involved dispossession, often violently, but once you've been deprived of land and resources, then what's supposed to happen to you? Well, we were often corralled onto prison colonies called reservations. The government was obligated to kind of provide for our needs from basic foodstuffs, not all of which arrived on time, and sometimes people starved. And then our children were taken away to assimilated boarding schools to, kill the Indian and save the man, as the slogan went. In other words, it unfolds and snowballs over time throughout the successive waves of policy. Finally, very importantly, it's understood to be cross-generationally transmitted, which is that there's something going on at the ancestral level through those kinds of experiences that is understood to be passed down. What exactly it is and how it's passed down is the subject of current exploration and debate. People offer different reasons, whether they're spiritual ones or epigenetics or what have you. The idea here, though, is that historical trauma can snowball down through the generations until it's healed or addressed therapeutically, so that the only real way out is to acknowledge it and then to do something about it. Historical trauma has entered widespread circulation throughout Indigenous communities. Probably it's more widespread in Indigenous life than it is in academia. And it's been taken up because of the socio-political functions it serves. There are lots of these you can point to. I'll just offer a quick few. It sort of seizes a moral high ground in terms of your discourse and interaction with people. It allows you to make a case and make a point that insulates from some kinds of interrogation or critique, at least in some kinds of venues or settings. It helps to legitimate claims. So post-traumatic stress disorder and psychological trauma at its inception back in the 1860s has always been tied to claims-making functions. It originated in railway accidents in the UK back in the 1860s, and it originated, this is personal trauma now, just psychological trauma, because people would be in railroad accidents and stumble off the trains. There'd be things wrong with them that no doctor could say, here's the problem in medical, biological terms. And so, these people were wanting to make a claim against the railroad companies for damages for these injuries, but there was no biological underpinnings for them. So psychological trauma was born from that, and it's always been entangled with claims making. When Vietnam veterans came home from that war with troubles, the American Psychiatric Association leadership basically said, we don't need a new diagnosis. These problems, we can account for them all in what we have. But it was really through activism by Vietnam veterans against the war and mobilizing into the DSM process that they were able to get PTSD accepted. And PTSD, of course, is necessary if you want disability payments from the Veterans Administration, those kinds of things. So it's simply pointing out that it's always been about claims making. It also refashions identity in the process of ascribing or attributing this to people. And when it comes to Indigenous people, historical trauma, the worry, of course, is that it really fixes us as people who are fundamentally wounded by history that we carry with us or have the impacts of colonial subjugation in a way that is a wounding, in a way that is injury of some sort. And in this sense, it sort of remakes the self, that it is entailed in recognizing and attributing damage, disorder, disability to Native people by virtue of our suffering of it. Now, the genealogy of historical trauma is probably worth considering for just a moment. Where does it come from? What's its origin story? And of course, it arises after the ratification of PTSD. PTSD was a formal psychiatric way of talking about this. Certainly, psychoanalysts have talked about trauma and psychological trauma and its treatment before then, but it entered a kind of medicalized approach to psychiatry in the DSM. And in some ways, it's a specific expression of what we might recognize as therapy culture. Therapy culture has been described, for example, by sociologist Frank Ferretti as a response societally to the disorientations of modernity. So, modernity has long said to involve a collapse of the traditional and a move toward the future looking and approach to having to actually self-fashion and make your own way in a different kind of world. And the idea is that therapy culture promises self-fulfillment, that you can find emancipatory possibilities through counseling, but in doing so, it really promotes vulnerability. The idea is that we're all wounded, we're all vulnerable, we're all fragile in certain ways. It's what the famous clinical psychologist Paul Meehl used to refer to as the spun glass theory of the human mind, that any shock could shatter us. And so therapy culture depends in some ways on that sort of idea. Even though it promises emancipation and self-fulfillment and actualization, it often ends up promoting further individuation. It does this in part because therapy culture tends to stigmatize the support of your informal relationships, your friendships, your family relationships. Sort of says, those people don't have expertise in what ails you. You really need to instead get professional treatment or professional counseling. And so therapy culture tends to prescribe a reliance on professionals in this way that kind of underscores and accentuates vulnerability and talks about how you need professionals to rely on. So ultimately, in the end, the concern about therapy culture, according to people like Ferretti, is that it appears to involve a retreat to the interior realm of the private self. But in reality, it opens up this private realm to professional management in ways that have increasingly become the business of government and other external institutions. So governmentality is wedded to therapy culture in all kinds of really interesting ways, whether it's for the school systems or other ways, jails, prison systems, and so on, that therapy culture tends to come to the fore. And according to Ferretti, then, the worry is that this represents a professional colonization of everyday life. So on the basis of this kind of brief analysis, and we can go more into this if you want when we talk about it, we might ask, in this context, what it means when entire generations of Indigenous peoples are said to suffer from historical trauma and to be, quote, at risk, unquote, for psychosocial problems. What it means when community-based healing projects promote ideals of emotional woundedness, cathartic verbal self-expression, and self as project introspection at the core of their therapeutic activities. What might Indigenous self-determination response to colonization look like if we instead celebrated mastery much more than fragility and cultivated what the Anishinaabe intellectual postmodern theorist Gerald Visner labels as survivance rather than what he labels victimry? And survivance, as you might know, is a portmanteau of survival and resistance. It's meant to understand the persistence of Native people well beyond society's expectations that we would be extinct by 1920 or so. So, Indigenous historical trauma. That's sort of round one. Now let's go into round two, recounting the Coup tale. Presumably you've heard of Coup tales, war narratives that were really important in northern plains Indian life, lots of Indian lives, but certainly on the plains. I'm thinking about the northern plains especially because these tales were expressive of a certain kind of ethos, a cultural ethos that predominated. And I'm going to give an example to start with from the life history of an Aaniih medicine person and warrior named Bull Lodge. Bull Lodge was a prominent Aaniih leader. He was born around 1802, died in 1886. He was gifted at the age of 12 by the spirits with a vision for crafting a war shield. This is my great-grandfather's drawing of that war shield that he received in his vision. It's a thunder being on a shield with the colors are all significant with the rainbow and light and dark and so on. And he was instructed during his teen years to really go fast and pray on successive occasions atop high buttes. And this is a typical Plains Indian religious practice of getting power. You go high on a butte, you strip naked, you sit out there all by yourself in the elements. You might cut yourself, you might sacrifice a finger joint, and you cry, you wail, you call out in pain for pity from those above. And with any luck, with no food, no water, sacrifice, someone above will notice you and come visit you and give you a dream or a vision for help in your life. And so he did this on 7 buttes over 6 or 7 years, sequentially fasting from 7 days and nights to 6 days and nights to 5 days and nights, and had visions and dreams and were given gifts of power that were to be exercised throughout his life. These gifts are more like the knowledge for how to do it and what to do it, and then he would wait to be told when it was time to become a doctor, for example, or to start doing practicing as a warrior with his war medicine. Now, the textual origins of this story, and this is one of the Native Studies pieces that I spent time on, comes from the work of my great-grandfather, Frederick Peter Gahn. Fred Gahn was employed by the Works Project Administration sponsored Montana Writers Project during 1941-42. This was a project in the state of Montana designed to collect folklore, and the people who ran it made sure that there were Indians on reservations also employed to solicit folklore from their own communities. So my great-grandfather, his job for a year and a half was to go talk to old people and write down the kinds of things they said. And so he had this done, the idea was it would all be published as part of the Montana Writers series. They were going to do an Indian volume in that series. They had other reservation field workers on different reservations, but he was the most prolific of all of these, and not all of them even had someone doing it. He wrote about 400 pages of Gros Ventre history, 300 pages of legends, all in longhand. And his crowning achievement was this biography, Bull Lodge's life. About 170 pages of longhand script, and he wrote it in 4 parts in keeping with traditional cultural notions among Aaniih and our relatives, the Arapahoes, of a 4-stage to the human life. His collaboration, the reason he could do this is because he talked with Bull Lodge's living daughter, Garter, Snake Woman, who herself was in her 80s, and who had been told all this stuff by her father about his life and his experiences and had no idea why until she said, my great-grandfather came along. And finally, she understood what she had all this for, and it was to convey it to him so he could write it down. I want to convey now, just briefly, the vignette that kind of closes Bull Lodge's life in part 4. It's a deathbed narrative. And so Bull Lodge, it is said, was told he had 8 days left to live before he would pass on. And so he and his family had kind of a watch with him for those times. On the 7th night, he gathered his family and he told stories about his visions and dreams and revelations for them. And then on the final night, called them back again, and everyone gathered in his lodge. And his daughter recounted that final gathering by saying, quote, on this night that my father was to die, he told many stories of his escapades and the many thrilling experiences he encountered during his past life, as if reviewing his life. Now, it sounds familiar. Modern audiences can easily imagine the kind of communicative crafting of a self-life narrative encompassing an individual legacy for posterity. It sounds very autobiographical and familiar in that way to us. But as I considered that interpretation, 2 problems really stood out to me. The first was that the autobiographical impulse is a product of modern modes of life. It's steeped in reflexive selfhood, autonomous individualism, confessional expressivity, structured possibilities for privacy, things that did not hold in Gros Ventre life in that time period. And so because pre-reservation life was organized so much differently, the autobiographical impulse probably wouldn't have made much sense for the nature of this telling. Second, the many stories of his escapades, as his daughter said, and the many thrilling experiences that he narrated that night appeared in this text anyway to include primarily war stories that in some cases barely involved Beau Lodge himself. So he told a story about his enemy friend, whose name was Sits Like a Woman, who went on a war party. Beau Lodge was there, but it really wasn't about Beau Lodge. It was more like about this war party. He told the longest war story that night that was recorded as a warrior named Bobtail Horse, who rode against the Blackfeet, or the Southern Pagan, and was unseated from his horse and had to make his way back hundreds of miles to the Gros Ventre camps on hand and foot. His moccasins wore out, his feet were all cut up, he was crawling on hands and knees by the time he arrived. So this story of like immense triumph for long odds. Thus, on his deathbed, Beau Lodge told war stories. Here I felt was a bit of a mystery. Why would a dying man gather his family, kiss his grandbabies alongside him, and then begin to recount tales of hardship, violence, rivalry, and triumph that in at least some cases appeared to have little to do with himself? In some, these final events from Beau Lodge's life would seem to require some alternative account. And so that's what I've been trying to work on with respect to this particular area here. Let me shift now to talk about Aaniih war deeds. The literature on our people has identified how we've had certain ideals that have persisted from pre-reservation all the way through to today. Ideals have been described as ferocity, tenacity, and the pursuit of primacy against kind of rival peoples. And we've had a people who have been described as rival on our reservation with us for an entire time too. So that's part of the context for this. But traditionally speaking, means of achievement among Gros Ventre people were recognized as ability, prayer, and special powers. And so, ability is something you can hone and practice at and get good at. Prayer, people who are instructed to sort of pray every day, all the time for things, because your life depended on these relationships and gifts and the attendance of those above. And then special powers, which were the kinds that Beau Lodge got by going up on the ridges and crying for vision. But we had ambivalent relations to power, evidently. Not everyone agreed that that was a good way to go. Some thought if you get that kind of special power, you sacrifice some of your life for doing it. So it wasn't something that everyone necessarily felt was the best thing to do. But distinguished achievement was really central to the life of the career of men, especially. And they called it a career, and it translates into English as career. And it has to do with war honors and raiding and getting horses. Because the Northern Plains throughout the entire historical period was a cauldron of violence because of fighting over the war trade, the robe trade and the beaver trade. Guns came from one direction, horses from another. The imbalances were really crazy, and so it was just warfare constantly. We were a very small people, never numbering more than about 3,000, trapped between the Blackfeet Confederacy to the west and the Cree-Assiniboine Alliance to the east, who were all battling it out over the robe trade. And so raiding, risking one's life were really the culmination of the achievement that Gros Ventre men aspired to on behalf of the community. And this is commemorated in the names of lots of my ancestors. So my great-great-great-great-grandmother was named Killed in the Brush. Her daughter was named First Kill. They had kids named Striker, Killed at Night. I have other relatives named Kills Flying, Two Strikes, Many Plumes, Meets the Enemy, and of course Gone to War, which is where gone comes from. So it's funny because you look at some early Indian psychology literature and people talk about how Indians compared to white people are cooperative rather than competitive. And I would submit to you that that was not true of our community, that rivalry and competition were built in ways that were really striking. There are narrative exemplars of this kind of Gros Ventre attention to these ideals. So I talked already about Beau Lodge and Bobtail Horse's agentic triumph by surviving the attack upon the Pagan. Alfred Kroeber produced war stories in his 1908 work on Gros Ventre people, in which he has one by a woman named Watchesall, who rode to war against the Pagan and was captive, and it took a year to get home, and it's a lot of harrowing experiences that she had. This is listed as a war story. And also, when I did my own project for my master's thesis in the 1990s, I went to our elders on the reservation and tried to interview as many as I could to ask them what it means to be Gros Ventre from their vantage point and perspective today. And the number one of those things I asked was, who do you think we admire? Who is someone who stands out as being a paragon of these ideals? And the person that was most nominated was this person here, Red Whip. Red Whip basically was close to what was an institution that gets translated as bosom friend or inseparable friend. You do stuff together and you would never abandon each other in war. Well, they were out at war together with a Crow war party when a bunch of Sioux attackers came down from the mountains, totally overwhelmed. His friend was immediately wounded and had to be laid in a coulee, and the Sioux were coming to kill them. And Red Whip, didn't want to abandon his friend, so he'd charge out and kill one or two people and run back in and, can I get you up? Let's get going. He said, I can't. You got to leave me. And so he did this 4 times before his friend finally released him from that obligation, and he was able to run and escape and look back and saw them attacking his friend. So 4 successive charges against Aaniih. And this is recorded in a book from 1913 called The Vanishing Race, in which Dixon had the last great Indian council called Indians from All Plains tell these kinds of war stories. Something that came up, of course, in the Gros Ventre Cultural Identity Project. It's one of the stories that my great-grandfather included in his texts that he did in the 1940s. And the recreational complex for young people at Fort Belknap Agency is named after Red Whip because of these kinds of deeds that we're trying to commemorate. So that's an example of the kinds of stories that might be told, but the conditions of narration are kind of interesting as well and important to attend to. So as I've said, Gros Ventre men pursued careers, and these careers had to do with warfare and raiding, and they aspired to prominence, to being really regarded in the community. And this required the war honors I'm talking about and property for redistribution. You could not be a prominent person, you could not be a leader unless you gave away extravagantly, generously at all kinds of instances. But a prominent man was one with so many war honors that he was, quote, his wrist would be made slim from being pulled up to recite them. So it's not that you just get up and volunteer, you're pulled forward to tell a war story on different occasions. And in fact, there were lots of occasions in Gros Ventre life when you needed to tell war stories. It was conventional and necessary. So if a successful raid happened and the people came home, a warrior would need to tell a war story. Scouts return from finding out if the enemy is nearby, someone has to tell a war story. You knock down the center pole for what was called our Sundance, someone has to tell a war story. There are competitions between rival soldier societies, the Wolfmen and the Starmen, and those competitions involve warriors telling war stories. When you put up a new lodge for the first time, a new teepee, someone has to tell a war story. When you remove food from a keeper's lodge, a pipe keeper's lodge, like a priest's lodge, bad things will happen unless someone tells a war story. When you name children, someone tells a war story. When you pierce children's ears, someone tells a war story. So war and war stories loomed large. There's reasons for this contextually and historically. It's sort of a modern cliche to talk about warfare and Indian people today, where you've got these historical discourses about savagery, you've got gender disparities in that, although women could tell war stories too, and sometimes did, and had war and coup opportunities as well, just not as much as men, and they didn't have the kind of career in that way that men had. But we can ask questions about patriarchy and what it might mean to want to think about how might achievement play out in a way that isn't so one-sided in terms of that gender disparity. Really, we want to acknowledge, I think, that there are 2 conflicting legacies of the warrior ethos. One of those legacies is mastery. And it pertains to properties and attributes like agency, ambition, achievement, activity, audacity, energy, talent, what I've sometimes called the eruption of liveliness over frightful circumstance, bitter ordeal, danger, despair, and destruction. You also have violence. And that has to do with things that we would all look at and repudiate today. Society is completely built around war. In many instances, child soldiers, the killing of non-combatants, enslavement of war captives, desecration of the dead, the taking of war trophies. There was one Northern Plains tribe that actually would sacrifice enemy women sometimes for a certain ritual. So these practices are clearly out of step with modern sensibilities. So one goal I have as I think about these things is to find a way to preserve the interest and emphasis on mastery and all that might entail, while repudiating in some ways the issues of the latter violence. Okay, so then in round 3, let's think about how do we reassess the coup tale? How do we make sense of it to begin with, to know what its possibilities are for a speech genre today? And I want to do that by talking about really an example that opens up why it's necessary to track this. Coup tales have been the subject of scholarly consideration. I talked about life narrative, and I mean, Kate Shanley has spent some time with this in particular. I want to explore a bit more deeply how these tales function, so that's what we'll do in this section. And so for Grolance, the telling of war stories could change the world for the better. That's in some ways the take-home point around what I want to try to understand here. So here's an example of this wheel game. So here you have a wheel. This was the pinnacle of gambling in pre-reservation days among our people, and it would involve two rivals, especially if there were two rivals who were well matched and highly prominent. The community would take a great deal of interest in these gambling games. And so you'd have a court, I don't know, maybe as long as this room, a log demarcating the ends of the court, and you'd have this wheel here about yay big, and you'd have sticks. And each man would take turns rolling the wheel down the court and trotting along sort of backwards alongside of it and trying to skew a stick through those webbings there. And when you did, the wheel would fall, and the stick would touch some bead. These were colored beads. Different colored beads meant different kinds of rewards if it was in the middle, etc. So there's a reason why. So that's the game. And high stakes gambling. So families would put up everything on a relative who was in this. And the biggest games were those between enemy friends or war friends. This was an institution that we had as well of rivals. And so my great-great-great-grandfather, Lame Bull, entered into such a game with an old warrior named White Owl, considerably his senior, considerably more prominent. He was an up-and-comer at the time. And, his father always told him, don't gamble. It's not worth it. Just do by ability and prayer alone. But Lame Bull took him up, felt he couldn't risk this, turning down this man's invitation, because it would acknowledge that this person is more prominent, and you would lose status. And so he did agree to play for it. And essentially, he was defeated. He'd never played this game before. He was defeated. Everyone came. They gambled everything. They ripped down his mother's lodge, took the bowls out of her hand. I mean, they had nothing because of his loss to this man. And fortunately, it didn't destroy him in the way it might have. The goal was to destroy him as an up-and-comer. And he was able to come back. He ended up being a priest of one of our pipes and so on. So it turned out okay, but that's what's at stake in this kind of concept. Now, what's interesting about this game, the reason I'm telling you about it, is because one of the things that they would do is before they would go, they might hold this wheel up to their head and just be quiet and think. And everyone would just sit utter silence watching. And what you would be doing is concentrating on a war deed, something you had done in war, a gun you had captured, an enemy you had touched, whatever it was. And the idea was somehow this would harness luck or fortune to help you have an advantage in the next roll, the next turn, to do better at this game. And the audience would sit and speculate, think about what, because they obviously knew people's war deeds from having told all the time. Let's see which one's he going to throw at him. That's sort of the way it's talked about. And at the end, of course, the winner would narrate which deeds he had used in this way to get the advantage and win the game. So how could concentration on a war deed alter the outcome of this game? That's what I wanted to know. So you might imagine that it's just like morale. You're boosting morale. I can do it. But there's more to it going on as they describe what this kind of concentration effort was like that shows that it probably wasn't that. And so now I need to talk about 4 intersecting concepts of pre-reservation cosmology that intersect here. And we'll do this kind of quickly because I know we want to wind down. The first is life. And life is understood to first be a gift of the Supreme Being. It's not from inside humans. Humans get it from those above. And it comes from the Supreme Being. It might be, distributed down the pantheon of beings, but in any case, it's exogenous to humans. It's dependent on the wish of the one above. The one above's wishes are what keep people living. It can be extended through prayer, beg and beseech the one above and other beings for longer life, and it can be shortened through bad actions. So if you don't live a good life and you're taking advantage of other people and so on, then that could shorten the life that you had. Life is the source of all blessings, of all prosperity, of all goodness, and it's incompatible with misfortune, sickness, poverty, and untimely death. So life is this, it just bursts and animates people in ways that are good. Relatedly, we have wish. And wish is the expression of personal desire through an intense concentration of thought. So it involves thinking and heavily concentrated thinking. And there's really 8 attributes that I pulled out from, when anthropologists were talking to our people in the 1930s and recording and writing down a lot of this stuff. Tried to make sense of it in a systemized way. Here are 8 attributes that comes from that. Wish is exercised by the one above and controlling the cosmos. It's an attribute of all persons, whether human or non-human. It's an ability that can be cultivated toward greater potency. So some are stronger thinkers, some are weaker thinkers in terms of their ability to make wish become reality. It's a domain of human conflict. Through contrary wishing, there can be a battle of thinking that human beings can enter into. It resonates with and calls for action by other than humans. It's additive across persons, both human and other than human, for greater efficacy. And this is the essence of ceremony. Ceremony is bringing everyone together with the same thoughts to try make sure reality comes into existence in that way. It's expressed verbally through utterances like blessing and cursing. And it's very immoral to curse other people because people understand you actually might hurt them. And it's grounded, of course, then in interpersonal relationships and marriage. This is a fundamentally interpersonal kind of set of understandings about wish. Next concept is power, and that is this ability to bring the world into alignment with one's wishes. Exercised then through the efficacious concentration of thought that could generate reality. One of our names for the Supreme Being was He who controls all by the power of thought. And it's interesting if you think about these interrelated concepts like life, wish, power. He was also referred to as the owner of life, also referred to as the master of all. And also this were property of these other beings that were really ranked in terms of their power. So non-humans, the 4 holy old men, then the sun, the moon, the thunder being, etc. And humans are ranked as well. In fact, we were one of only 5 tribal groups that was age ranked, formally age graded in our societal life. Young people are the most, a baby is the weakest and most vulnerable. Old men might actually have some power, and that's why you needed to be very respectful. You didn't want to upset someone like that. And ultimately, lowly humans then depend on prayer and ceremony to enlist more potent other than humans to wish on their behalf. That's how good things happen, to exercise power through wish toward the desired shaping of an unfolding reality and the rejuvenating circulation of life. Final concept, speech. It's a vocable utterance of thought, conveys a person's thought into the world. It's connected to life insofar as breathing and breath are markers of vitality, and of course speech requires breath. It's thought plus breath, you might think, mediated by language, which is another attribute of persons. All persons, animal persons can have language and can speak. Singing might be the most elevated form of speech. That's like the first utterance by Earthmaker, for example, was a song. And Aaniih ceremonial practice always involved what my great-grandfather wrote as, smudge, song, pipe, and prayer. Song is the singing, of course, and that's with smoke. You're pulling tobacco smoke in, breathing it out, and you can see smoke. Smudge, you're burning plant materials, and the smoke goes up, and you see what happens when that smoke goes. So these things involve transformation of materials into other kinds of domains or modalities, whether it's burning of tobacco into smoke or transforming thought into sound through singing and prayer. In Aaniih tradition, owing to its origins in thought, speech had the potential to channel wish, shape reality, and circulate life. Therefore, speech is actually a moral domain. There are prescriptions against negative talk. You might bring something bad about, so you don't say bad things. So we might wonder what it means to offer a trauma narrative in counseling for someone who might have been oriented in this way. If you're not supposed to talk about negative things in ways that might endanger unfolding reality. So, because of all of this, there are some powerful Gros speech genres, song being the big one I talked about, prayer being an obvious one, ritual narratives, which go with certain ceremonies, of course, being important, plus coup tales. So, we're back to coup tales then, and in this final round I want to reclaim the coup tale. Coup tales are traditional exemplars for celebrating mastery and survivance. The problem is that they're deeply entangled with warfare, violence, and the taking of a life. So to be useful for us today, this speech genre would need to be updated in some manner. Ideally, I'd want to preserve mastery while repudiating the violence. And I think this involves or entails a neo-traditional approach, which would blend the traditional with the modern in some useful way. Let's just get back to the functions of Gros Ventre Coup tales then. War stories were narratives of agentic triumph, in which thought, wish, will had become instrumentally manifest in human action under circumstances harboring the greatest likelihood of death and destruction. You're off at war, you're going to die, or the enemy is going to die, and all that you hope, wish, and dream and want for yourself and for your future is manifest in those moments. So there are two distinctive functions I think we can point to with respect to these two tales. The first is they're representational. They commemorate brave deeds. But the conditions in which coup tales were told reveal functions beyond just representation. So the second function starts to come into view when you recognize some of those ways in which ear-piercing, naming, putting up a teepee, etc., that coup tales were told. It involves a harnessing or moving of power. There's a pragmatic function here of trying to get something done. It involves the dispensation of potentially generative or enlivening power. Say in naming and ear-piercing, we are trying to ensure a good life, long life for a young person. Destructive power, like encountering war dangers, scouts coming back with the story, or felling the pole for the Sundance, which is based around war. Or reversing taboos, taking the food from the priest's lodge. Bad things would happen unless someone told a war story. So, beyond narrative representations, an account of this or that happening, toward narrative efficacy in the world, altering reality in some desired way, through the narrative recirculation of life, which is to say a transference of maybe some kind of residual vitality from the past actions in the account to present lives. And here's how I summarize this in one paper from the past. Quote, above all, as commemorations of triumphant agency in which mortal danger had been neutralized by overwhelming vitality, such narrative events retain some capacity to circulate and redistribute to the assembled audience at least some measure of that same vitality, the generative manifestation of thought or wish that had been made possible the very actions portrayed in the narrated events themselves. So it was that among the Gros Ventre, certain kinds of narratives and the efficacious power of thought, these tellings simultaneously commemorate and express literally imparted life. In some, Gros Ventre coup tales are not just figuratively or metaphorically, but literally recirculating of life. So, in this sense, this is why Bullage gathers his grandbabies and is telling all this stuff, and he's telling all these violent things that have happened, because he's trying to pass life onto them through this instance, is my proposal. So the coup tale in this essence would seem to remain a potent cultural resource reflecting actions of mastery, agency, and vitality in some pretty distinctive ways. If we think then about a neo-traditional approach to the coup tale, which is to say blending the traditional with the modern, we want to repudiate violence, but preserve the preoccupation with ambition, achievement, energy, mastery, talent. Which is to say, I think we want to identify modern circumstances in which to witness eruptions of liveliness. It's not about violence and it's not about war, but it is about vitality, community leadership, sports teams, legal battles, business successes, graduations from school. There's all kinds of domains in which Indian people already kind of mark and celebrate these sorts of things, but we don't think of them necessarily as the kinds of narratives that we could graft on to this traditional thing. And so, in closing, I've considered two genres of speech: the historical trauma narrative, which is modern, the coup tale, which is traditional. I've tried to explore the respective functions and origins to a degree, and I've concluded that the coup tale is the narrative antithesis of historical trauma. It celebrates mastery rather than fragility. It cultivates survivance rather than victimry. And so, in this move toward new traditions, I think we should be engaged in recognizing Indigenous self-determination as a recasting of past traditions in terms of modern practices for future vitality. It's a selective process, a creative process of contemporary culture making. And so I wanted to bring this to you today as part of NASM. So I've written a lot about stuff. You know that Gone to War was this ancestral name, so that's my website, and you can find out a lot more about these issues there. Thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to our exchange.
really thank you so much for a very engaging presentation and the stories, the historical context. And I'm struck by how many students we have in the room today. And so I want to make sure that we have time in particular for students' comments, questions, or reflections. So I just want to maybe a show of hands for people who have a question they want to get in. I've got a few comments to get us started, but I want to make sure we can stay good with time and then have time afterwards for individuals to meet with Professor Gon. So just show of hands for people who think they might have a question or comment that they, in a few minutes, will want to raise. Okay, we have one. We have at least one. I'm thinking there are others, but people are a little shy. And we might have faculty and academic staff too. I want to make sure and include all of you. So I see we have at least one, and we probably have more. So I'd like to start with something you just ended with which I thought was quite profound. And it had to do with how you were proposing the neo-traditional approach. And so speaking to you as someone very interested in culture and mental health, and also as a therapist, and someone who's worked in communities that have experienced trauma, and have worked a bit in group CBT, was privileged to participate with Professor Laframboise in the early 2000s when American Indian life skills was, becoming known to communities and being adapted for our urban communities here. And so I was very struck by the three parts you mentioned in the neo-traditional approach: repudiating violence, preserving preoccupation with achievement and mastery, which I think ties into the use of the Coup tale, and then identifying context for eruptions of liveliness and thriving. The middle point there, preserving preoccupation. Could you say a little more about that? And where I'm going with this is, I think where folks maybe would want more understanding is around how the two concepts here are necessarily antithetical. And I think about the idea of where I think you're going to go with preserving preoccupation is that we all have a history and we all have a story. We have that individually. We have that as part of our who we are as a tribe. I'll use that with a small t. And Indian communities are not monolithic, and you've written about this extensively as well. What may apply in one cultural context with one Indian community may often, but not always, apply to another. But I'm wondering about this acknowledgement in the very beginning about the trauma of a community or a family or in a story, so that the processing can occur. And so, are there parts of this that are not actually antithetical? Maybe theoretically they may be, but practically as a therapist, I'm thinking about if I'm working with a person from a traumatized community, part of their story is often collective even before they've had the start of the individual. That might be the place I have to start to understand the story. So is there a way that preserving preoccupation with achievement and mastery as part of the neo-traditional approach is not necessarily antithetical?
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying are antithetical are historical trauma narratives and coup tales. And that's not to say that there aren't aspects of acknowledging adversity in the celebration of mastery that can be non-antithetical in that way. So I think that's kind of what you're getting at here.
Yeah.
And a lot of this depends on the framing and the point, and the emphasis of how and what you just choose to talk about and under what conditions. So, historical trauma has, maybe as most concepts do that sweep through and speak to legacies of suffering, gets warped sometimes. So I have a colleague who teaches at a flagship public university in a state where there's a lot of Indians and reservations. So she teaches Native studies and sometimes Native environmental stuff or religious stuff. And she was telling me, some years back that Indian students were telling her they can't take an exam in this course, they can't study this material, they can't write papers on this material because it's, awakening their historical trauma. And she, of course, that's ridiculous. And she saw through it and wouldn't put up for it. Put a stop to it. But I guess it shows you that there's an extreme that this can run in certain ways. That is, in the end, you've got some handful of students, perhaps only, undermining their own education at an institution that they're at, in the name of historical trauma. And so no one thinks that that's a good or right way to think about this stuff. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't acknowledge and understand and even convey narratively the adversity we faced. It's really a question about where you land. I think the Indian story is one of having come through all of that, and here we are, and we're thinking about what our successive generations will be able to have, what we can leave them, what we can support them with, how we can make good futures for ourselves. And I'm not sure that historical trauma needs that big of a place in that endeavor. I think talking about, first we experienced this, then we experienced that, and we're here. A story that's about how we're still here and how we can move forward. That's not to say that there aren't casualties. Colonial subjugation ripples out through, and poverty and discrimination in all kinds of ways. We have lots of casualties. And that's not to say that counseling and psychotherapy are not helpful for people who are casualties in these ways. But let's be really clear, there's no amount of mental health or helping services that are going to solve the problems of any country. Our problems are colonial, social structural, and require the kinds of efforts that go well beyond tinkering with the interior life of one person and the next and the next. So there's a bigger project at stake. It is one that is about advancing Indigenous futurities where we need to bring the most talented, artistically creative, inclined people we can, whether it's poets or novelists or painters or craftspeople, to envision stuff that's new, envision stuff that I can't envision. I don't have that talent. But we need a future that's compelling and that can call us to something good, and that's not only being driven from some past that is monolithically represented too often as one of just despair and integration. I don't know anyone who can thrive with a narrative that is, primarily despair and integration.
Thank you. I have a follow-up to that, which...
Can I ask a question?
Oh, sure, yes, go ahead, Paula.
I'm so impressed by your talk, Professor Don. I want to say the way I'm understanding this is you're talking about reframing of the way we talk about the kinds of things that have happened in the past. That the framing that has been used for good reasons, coming out of our understanding of what has happened to other peoples in the past, has been through this lens of historical trauma. And what you're suggesting is a reframing, and if we're going to take a model to do that, we might use a model that is already in existence and has been in existence for generations, and you're really relivening that and re-giving that to us, and with some modifications. So that's what I'm understanding you to be doing. I also want to say how much I appreciate what you say about the power of negative words, negative discourses, negative, that if we believe and take into ourselves that we are traumatized individuals, sometimes that prevents us from seeing the ways in which we thrive and the possibilities, future possibilities. So I really understand what you're saying, and I congratulate you, and I think it's great, and I love the things. I would like to know more about how we repudiate violence in that picture. That's just a question that you can address or not.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you. So that I'm comforted because you got it, and that's what I was trying to get across, and I appreciate it. And, part of the repudiating violence, for one thing, it is important to know that Indian people serve in the military, disproportionately high rates, as you know, and I was in the Army myself for a time. And so it's not always repudiating violence, because actually people still do tell coup tales, actually, from the wars that the United States has been in, that Indian people have served in for these past decades. But in terms of largely repudiating the associations with violence, I think it's important because these eruptions of liveliness are really what I think are the core of what we want to, and there's all kinds of ways that we continue to grapple with it, incredible adversity, seemingly insurmountable challenges, and sometimes coming out ahead, I mean, it's like, my people were among the first on the Northern Plains to sue the United States government for theft of lands and, graft by the Indian agents and all that kinds of thing. And we won a case in 1935 doing that. We have valued education, higher education among our people for a very long time because we saw that that was the way to know how to defend yourself and how to try to make a way that would be self-determined, so accountable to a community, dependent on your own kind of vision, but in the modern world and having facility with modern institutions and so on. So there are just, I listed them. I mean, sports are a way you see it a lot. A war bonnet used to go to warriors who had been out to battle on numbers of occasions and really were ultimately ultra prominent. Now, if you win the championship in the basketball tournament in high school, you get a war bonnet, in our neck of the woods. And that's an example of people acknowledging this is the sort of rivalry and competition that my community has been interested in attending to and celebrating for as long as anything's been written down about us. And certainly even before then in terms of the oral tradition to whatever degree some of that persists. So that's all I'm calling for is a rebalancing and a reframing in the way you talked about. Yeah.
Thank you. Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Joe. Yeah, so I'm really struck by, when I teach my classes, I kind of juxtapose, say, narratives of personhood and collective identity that Jewish people have. There's this common kind of thread of persecution, dispossession, and historical trauma, but the way that kind of the American system of representation in academics, newspapers, and all the pop culture places positions Native people as somehow different, and that we're not defined by the fact that we're not trying to explain why we're still here. We have a series of narratives that explain how we're damaged, and that's what I see as a difference. That this is moving things into. So the futurity of Native peoples depends on reframing how we think about who we are, where we come from. But it's interesting to think about that. As an archaeologist, look at places and how the importance of places in fashioning resistance and things like that. So, Masada, where Jewish people was, that's the resistance created in some people's minds the narrative of personhood. And I think we have those similar narratives, but they're just not being told by us. And so I really appreciate just being, of course, being attentive to problems and trauma that people have, which are very real. But the general consensus, I like the idea that we can reframe and recapture using Gerald's idea of victimry, that questioning what it means to be a victim, where it puts us as a people.
And the Jewish example, because that's where Maria was inspired to bring historical trauma to Indigenous experiences, is a useful set of contrasts for beyond just that, which has to do with, Jewish people a couple generations after the Holocaust started doing really well compared to how Native people who are many more generations out from some of the things we experienced. So that indicates that there's other things going on, and which raises the question of how much of historical trauma is in fact historical, and how much does it misdirect our attention away from the kind of ongoing colonial structures that disadvantage and deprive us of opportunities to move forward in self-determined ways that are hopeful and inspired and fresh. And so, one of the challenges of historical trauma is it's not clear we need it as a conceptual tool for health anyway, because there's plenty of personal trauma in Indian life, plenty of it. And you don't have to go back generations to find out why people are suffering today. And trying to figure out what to do about it is what we most need. And doing so with too few resources and all the other consequences of colonial legacy is part of the problem, probably why the Jewish experience has been so different.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm going to turn it over to the audience, because I want to reflect on that theme that you just raised around historical trauma, because you've actually written about historical trauma, like in First Nations community, the paper that came out in August, and I was struck by there's a section in this paper, and it has to do with a collaborative partnership between a reserve dwelling First Nations group and looking at historical trauma and alcohol use. And I just wonder, again, I'm a child psychiatrist, so I think about the transmission of story. And if we think about beyond just a narrative representation toward narrative efficacy, if we're giving young people, we're giving them the power to like shape their own narrative, and the third part of the model, narrative recirculation of life, there still is a context. And so one of the vignettes in this paper talks about disrupting the cycle of generational alcohol use in a group setting. And I wonder, I wonder in groups that I've led, for example, one of the first things you do in self-sharing and getting people's story is you try and, as a facilitator, make sure that, well, we're in a group, we got whatever, 60 or 90 minutes, we're not going to go too deep here because we got a lot of people to get through, but then how do we value the individual story? And so young people, Native American young people are, I think in many ways, they understand and they have been raised with historical trauma as part of an explanatory model. You know, why does this keep happening to our people? And it may be easier to say, well, yeah, he didn't take responsibility, but it also has to do with, like, this is part of our family culture and it's come down from. And as an explanatory model, sometimes that can help a young person, like, forgive the elder because part of this is out of their control. I mean, we can have a whole other discussion about genetics of alcoholism and how that's another big part of it, if you want to take a biological model. But, you know, I was raised with a culturally informed biopsychosocial model. And so culture and family trauma, transmission of trauma, I'm wondering how, again, that might play into at least an introduction, you know, acknowledging that there has been trauma and loss. And the purpose of this group is to, so that people kind of understand, acknowledging the history means, like, you have to acknowledge the narrative representation so that you can have efficacy, so you can move toward life. And I wonder, again, if there's a way, I know the fundamental premise is the two are antithetical, but I keep thinking about the idea of, if any of you know about, how many of you know about CBT, like what CBT, cognitive behavior therapy? The most effective CBTers are people who were trained in psychodynamic therapy, who have said, you know, that helps me get some understanding, but this patient in front of me has some goals, and I'm here to hear the goals. We're going to work together, and we're going to establish trust and work towards something collectively together. But it also allows me to get the story in the first couple sessions. So I'm just wondering about that again. You know, in a group setting, when young people come in, it's part of their family story. And it may allow them to then move forward. If there is a way to, in the beginning, acknowledge that this has happened to our community and our family and to my immediate family.
You know, I don't actually know how common it is for a young person to be socialized into historical trauma proper. You know, I mean, I think young people often do know something about the adversity their families experience, but also about what it achievements. I mean, despite or in the face of that. And that does seem like a potent resource for the clinical endeavor. And so I think inviting people to talk about how they're thinking and understanding, you know, whatever legacy they might have is probably useful therapeutically for a lot of people. I mean, what I'm talking about, I think, is really not focused on the clinical encounter or the clinical endeavor that much, and that's because that's too small. It's so small. It's important, so it's not that's an unfair question or that there's not good things to be thinking related to it, but you know, something like half of the adult American population has had a diagnosable mental disorder according to the best psychiatric epidemiology. A third of those have maybe tried to get services. So that's an issue. And then of those, the ones who get good care, standard of quality care is small. And ever since these past years with the pandemic, but even before, it's been hard to even get access to care, even if it's not quality care. In other words, to zoom in on the clinical is an important domain of endeavor to want to have work well. But it is to zoom quite a ways in terms of the suffering that Indigenous people are going through and what might be done to overcome it. And I think there's one lesson we drew from some research we did on historical trauma. This is Will Hartman, a former student of mine, and I, probably 10 years ago. He went off to a Northern Plains reservation to explore historical trauma and how it was being used by service providers and, in fact, by two very prominent medicine men in this reservation setting. And what was really interesting is that people didn't use the term. They used it in all kinds of idiosyncratic ways. I shouldn't say entirely idiosyncratic because we did classify them, but they don't mean the same thing when they use the term. It sort of means suffering, and it's a suffering that's tied to mistreatment in the past.
Yeah.
And that's sort of where it is. So I don't even know how many people in the colloquial sense are taking up historical trauma in the way that scholars talk about it, the way that Indigenous scholars have promoted it. So anyway, I like the idea of people representing the adversity of their family as they think about how to recover and heal. But even these medicine men disagreed over the degree to which they each took a different view on what historical trauma was equipping us to do. One was very focused on healing. It's about spiritual kind of processes that, and we need to heal in the spiritual way from it. The other one was about, this is about colonial subjugation and social structural embedded aspects of our world, and we need to figure out a way to change those social structural aspects. In other words, find a more just set of arrangements. And so you've got healing on one side and justice on the other side, and often that's how these get, somewhat contrasted. I kind of think healing is more likely to follow in the wake of justice than justice is to follow in the wake of healing. And so I think that the clinical, it's important, it's what we're training and what we do, but I think that there might be bigger bang for the buck outside of the clinical. That's, I guess, where I've settled.
Thank you. Now, yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Gon, for your talk and your presentation. Before being a PhD student, I was a classroom teacher for 10 years. And in Oakland, one of the ways that we were trying to counteract the really high suspension rates, specifically of Black boys and girls, was to introduce transformative justice, restorative justice, which is based in Indigenous practices. It does have some effect. It's not a complete solution to lower suspension rates, but I've always wondered, as a non-Indigenous person, and most of the people who are facilitating these circles are non-Indigenous, what are your thoughts on using Indigenous practices when they, in terms of like appropriation, and when they haven't been, I was not taught RJ models by an Indigenous person. So just your thoughts on that.
Great question.
Yeah, thanks for that. Knowledge circulates, practices circulate, culture circulates. This is why anthropologists don't like to use the term culture like a noun, because it pretends that there are these groups of humans that are encapsulated in some standard practice that can be opposed to some other group that is standard. Culture circulates. So we become, in modern life, especially in recent modern life, when the internet can give us knowledge about all kinds of things in a moment, all these different scripts and practices, possibilities for how to solve a problem in a way that is patterned and structured and that people have found useful. And so in that kind of hyper-information context, one wonders what misappropriation means. And yet, Native people, our religious practices were outlawed. An Indian agent can imprison you if you continue to do the sweat lodge or the sun dance for a long time. We didn't get the American Indian Religious Freedom Act until 1978. Even then, peyote, there's just things where there are questions, in mainstream society still about some of our practices. And so because it was very hard to preserve what we have left, there's a great deal of sensitivity, especially around religious practices, to misappropriation. So you've got both of these things happening at the same time. Knowledge is hard to contain. And so I guess if you don't want misappropriation, you better contain that knowledge as hard as you can. And that means not letting it loose, letting it out, talking about it in public ways, putting it online, anything like that. Because once it's in the public sphere, you can't control it anymore. Anyway, those are some reflections on that a little bit, which is simply to say that I think that if something is attributed to indigenous origins and you have the resources at all, try to enter into a relationship with an indigenous person to help guide it or to help be involved in it in some way. To me, a big part of our colonial experience is the erasure that leads modern America to not to have to know or grapple with the fact that there are living Indian people working for better futures today. And so the antidote to all this stuff is more Indian people, modern Indian people today, visible, public, engaged, known, and with mutual regard. And so I think that those are always a good thing to do, if even though at some pure level we can't contain knowledge, and so much of this stuff is written by anthropologists. That's all in the public domain.
Who are not Native American.
Who are not Native,
Yeah.
right? So right. It's just what. So anyway, there's so much out there. I just think the antidote to our colonial problems are relationships, and there's not enough of them. Presumably with relationship will come greater awareness, but empathy, and willingness to change, things that have kept us back.
There was a question from a student. You had a question, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. My question relates back towards the end of your presentation. Thank you so much for it. I was really interested in this idea of prayer and how you combined it to talk about both wish and speech.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, specifically this idea of like prayer that can also approach singing, and these elevated genres that you were speaking of.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks. Never been asked that quite before. It's very interesting. So, when people are like in a sweat lodge together, which is in my community probably the main form of traditional spiritual practice. It's a very embodied experience because obviously it's very uncomfortable. It's back to the idea of sacrifice to call down attention, so it's not supposed to be comfortable. So there's drumming and singing in there, and there's hot water being splashed on the rocks, which makes a really loud noise when the water hits and vaporizes. And people are very uncomfortable. And prayer is a cacophony in those moments where what you do is you're calling out, crying out for things that you need in life. People are shouting all at once. No one can hear because you're not talking to the humans, you're talking to those people, right? So in that sense, what you wish to have happen is what you're begging the spirits to help you with, to arrange their thinking, their thoughts around a reality that might emerge. Now, the challenge of this, let me just back up to frame it all. I mean, this is what our ancestors said who transitioned into reservation life, but who had been buffalo hunting people before then about these things. And so the practices endure, but the meaning's not stable, right? People make meaning and the meanings evolve. So I don't know if you asked all the people in the sweat lodge would they understand these things, if they would be talking about speech and thought and wish. Probably not, not that many of them. Maybe some would. But there is a continuity, though, from these things, and there's ideas that are not necessarily ever explained. It's funny, sometimes you ask elders questions and their answer is, I don't know, they just said do it this way. But in our case, we have some records about why they said to do it that way. So some of this is part of the contribution, I think, or at least that I'm hoping to make, is that I return to some of this indigenous knowledge that for our community had been preserved for reasons that our ancestors wanted that preserved. So my great-great-grandfather, the boy, he was called the last chief of the Gros-Ventres, he called in an anthropologist from Catholic University of America, Washington, D.C., who was a Catholic priest. That was very important because we were Catholics by then. And he was the last person in our community to hold a bunch of esoteric ritual knowledge about our sacred pipes. And he felt that if this didn't get written down, it would vanish forever. Because there was no young people, it was inconceivable in those days to figure out how to carry it on any other way. And so he and a bunch of communities worked closely with these anthropologists. They got written down what they wanted to have written down. And so important was that our community in the 1970s, our own education department republished these anthropological monographs by John Cooper and by Regina Flannery at our own expense, so that they would be available for curricular materials and for the community to have. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of volumes. So I think we're fortunate in that sense. I know that anthropologists can be a crafty bunch. Some of them were very exploitative in the past. Franz Boas, dug up skulls and sent them into the museum as part of making ends meet, right? So I know that there's not good stuff in that. Our case is a little unusual, perhaps. But I think that, so we have a record of some of this knowledge, and part of what I do is to think about that record and take that record, especially in part because of my ancestors who were involved in creating that record, and seeing how to make sense of it today in this kind of re-traditionalization, or just drawing on some continuity from the past as we look to the future in an adapted, modern, problem-solving, practical way. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Let's thank again our colleagues for a great talk and a stimulating. Today. We look forward to welcoming you next week for our next seminar series. So, thank you.
Good to see you all. Thanks for coming out.